The question I wanted to come back to, which I raised in the program Un Control One, was this question that I couldn't get to the bottom of, that since the war that awaits us must be to the Second World War, or rather to the Cold War, what the Second World War was to the First World War. There's the question, of at least an initial victory, or at any rate a major success for the Rovinchar Imperatrix, which must be achieved in particular by a war of movement mechanism. And so I also published this video in which I took up the question of the war of movement in the nuclear age, of the quantity of war of movement in the nuclear age. And the big question I was asking myself was how much of this war of movement was possible in the nuclear age. And the big question I was asking myself was whether this movement should be conceived differently. But I didn't see anything. Denis Digme, the listener who suggested a hypothesis and provided an expression, deserves my thanks. Hypothesis, and above all, giving me an expression. When you have an expression, you can already unlock things by conceptualizing things. And here's a formula I really like, which is the idea of war by proxy. The Cold War was essentially a global war of position, in contrast to the idea that it was a limited war. Conflicts like Vietnam and Afghanistan, which remained stagnant and resembled trench warfare, further exemplified this aspect of the Cold War on a global scale. And so, since we went from trench warfare to war of movement during the Second World War, we would have, compared to this kind of trench warfare, a war of movement. And so these would be dynamic proxy wars, i.e. Wars in which these proxy wars don't become fixed, but allow for rapid movement of the French moon, i.e. with states, for example, falling one after the other. And I found that extremely interesting because it got me thinking, and I said to myself that I had to go back to the morphology of the Great War to try and see it more clearly. So that's what I did, because here's something you have to see. It's that, I'm always telling you that there's the Cold War, which corresponds to the First World War. In reality, it's a little more complicated than that. The part of the war that I consider to correspond to the First World War in the Cold War, in reality, is only the last phase of the Cold War, after the détente of the early 1970s. That is the end of the 70s, normally the beginning of the Euro missile crisis, which I mentioned last time from the 70s, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, until the collapse of the USSR. It's this phase, really, which corresponds to the last war that broke out 30 or 40 years after the establishment of the empire in the cycle of Rovanchard imperialism. Let me remind you, establishment of the empire, 30, 40 years later, there's the war that's lost, and then there's Rovanchard imperialism, which comes along again 5 years later. So in this case, if you like, the Cold War starts as early as 1945, so you don't have to look at the whole Cold War. You have to look at this last phase of the Cold War. In the same way, if you look at the history of German-British relations, in reality, there is a form of competition and rivalry between the German Empire, Britain, which began the day after the proclamation of the German Empire, making the German Empire the British Empire's main competitor for world supremacy. In 1879, the alliance called the Duplice was formed, and it has remained static ever since, of the German Empire with the empire of other rich Hungarians, creating a kind of Germanic super empire in Central Europe, which threatens the whole of Europe. Thus, the British resolved to abandon their opposition to Russia, which had lasted throughout the 19th century, and commenced viewing Germany as their primary adversary. And then, of course, between the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the First World War in 1914, there was a whole arms race, particularly in terms of navies, between the British Empire and German Empire. So what you have to understand is that for the Cold War, it's the same, i.e. there are indeed series of battles and an arms race that begin fairly early on. But the important thing is this final phase, and that's what we need to study and relate to the First World War, which is very interesting in that it ends. It's not trench warfare right up to the end, where you stay in the trenches and suddenly it's all over. It's the armistice. So when the armistice was signed, it had been several months since the war of movement had resumed, and the troops were advancing in earnest. And how were they advancing? They were advancing thanks to the introduction of the tank into the Allied military system. And I've already explained how this often works. It's purely empirical, so it's hard to make a law out of it. But we often find that over the last 2 centuries, the next war, the next Great War, is fought mainly with the weapons that ended the previous war. And so, for example, aircraft and tanks reintroduce movement at the end of the First World War. These are the star weapons of the Second World War. The Second World War ended with nuclear weapons, which were the star weapons of the Cold War, dictating this kind of global trench warfare warfare. And I think I've already mentioned that the Cold War came to an end with the introduction of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, i.e. the race for electronic, satellite and other weapons, which are in part the star weapons of the next war. And if you think of Elon Musk's Starlink, if we think of the American surveillance capability, which helped the Ukrainians a great deal in their conflict, the intelligence capability is prodigious. And if you think of the very things that are likely to be caught on these submarine cable telecommunications tools, it's clear that this has become a priority battlefield. But it's also important to remember that the introduction of these weapons must have reintroduced a form of war of movement at the end of the 20th century of the Cold War, since that's what you see in World War I. So if Leo can show you the little series of images I've made by retrieving this from you'll find it's a video called World War I Time Lapse, since there are lots of interesting videos like this that allow you to find out, retrieve information and follow the evolution almost day by day or month by month for the Cold War conflicts. It helps you visualize things. So on this map, on this series of maps, you'll see it's the last 3-4 months. Which one do you want? This is World War I. There are in 208, that's it. So what you see is the last 4 months of the war. So August, September, October, November. We'll take the date of the 11th each time to go from month to month. As you can see, the front had stabilized for several years. In fact, since the beginning of 1998, the Germans had advanced into France. In August, it was evident that France suffered due to the collapse of the Russian Empire along with the USSR. This had disastrous consequences, demonstrated by the advantageous position the Germans gained through the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. This historical event can be observed on the displayed map. It enabled them to regain numerical superiority in France for some time and to make some headway. But then, as you can see, all of a sudden, over the last 3 months, things came to a halt quite quickly, precisely because the movement had started to become so important. The whole of France was liberated. And if the war had gone on for a few weeks, given the speed at which it was going, we would have penetrated Belgium and even German territory. And in the Balkans, the Allied forces also made a lightning advance towards Vienna. The end of World War I saw a resurgence of the war of movement with the introduction of tanks, marking a significant shift in warfare. And so the idea I came up with, based on the suggestion made to me, was to check, using the morphology of the final Cold War, that which corresponds to the Great War, to see in the final years, since it's a little longer, lasting a dozen years in fact, between the start of the Euromissile crisis in September 7777, in September 9779, if we consider that it began with the invasion of Afghanistan, and then you can go up to 1904, 94, 91. Looking back over the last few years, we can see that create the inaugural map in the year 1949 to align with the desired specifications. Do you have the country? Well, let me tell you, it's chronological, so it must be June 89. Well, I've got the countries, in fact. I've sorted them by country, you see. But it was the title of the file. It was June 1989. That's Poland. This is Poland? Yes, it is. Yes. So June 1989, free elections in Poland. And in fact, what I'm going to show you, so you can follow along, I'll give you the idea right from the start, is that, so there was the air missile crisis, as I told you, which was actually won by the Western camp, because from 1943 onwards, the missiles were actually deployed. So that was the first major defeat for the USSR, even though they were hoping that, because in fact what happened at the end of the 70s was that the USSR thought that it was the right time, that they were at the height of their power. They had to push the nail in somewhere, and I'm going to kick the bucket. And that's why we've got to push the nail in. And that's what aero missiles are all about. And so, well, I won't go back over it. You can see the video. It's in the bridge from too far away where I explained it to you. But this return of Soviet aggressiveness, so to speak. And then came the Reagan victory years in the missile crisis with the launch of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which made Gorbachev's Russia realize that it didn't have the capacity to win the conflict at that level, because Reagan had succeeded in negotiating what we haven't managed to do so far, Saudi Arabia. But Reagan had succeeded in obtaining an increase in production that caused the price of hydrocarbons to plummet in the mid-1990s. And so, whereas the Soviet Union had been counting on these foreign currencies to maintain its lifestyle and eventually finance investment in reforms, all of a sudden it was deprived of the money to carry out reforms, and so it couldn't invest to keep up with the problem of the Strategic Defense Initiative and the arms race. And so, finally, Reagan's introduction of this policy was to weaken the USSR sufficiently that it would no longer be able to hold on to its positions and be forced to give up gradually. And so you'll see that morphologically, because that's what we're interested in, i.e. From the point of view of the form the conflict takes, well, what's happening and what we saw at the end of the year of corresponds to a return to a war of movement. We have a strategic war of movement with countries falling one after the other, as if the territory dominated by the Soviets was gradually being invaded. This is what's interesting morphologically, because it allows us to conclude quite simply that in the Cold War, this was the phase of the war of movement. And this will enable us to analyze what a war of movement corresponds to today. So let's quickly review. What happened was that the USSR became weaker and realized that it no longer had the means to finance it. And so the setbacks began. The Soviets' weakening capacity to enforce itself, seen in the Prague Spring and earlier repression in Prague, played a part in its decline. Or before that, the repression in Budapest, in Gorbachev's self-confessed inability to do so, as he said at the end of, "We can't do it anymore." And in a speech to the UN, he said, "We're abandoning the Brezhnev doctrine because we no longer have the means." And so, although it had already started a little earlier, and that's what prompted him to say it, it led to the collapse of one Soviet regime after another. Then, in June of the year, free elections were held in Poland. Of course, it's a gradual process, i.e. Poland doesn't fall immediately, but already free elections have been held, which limits the power of the communists, and this power only weakens afterwards. After Poland, you have, so I'll ask Leo to follow the numbers. After Poland, in June of the year, we have October of the year with free elections in Hungary, which once again drives another nail into the fate of the Soviet bloc. After that, we have December of the year with the Czechoslovak Revolution, the so-called Velvet Revolution, and the most violent fall of the Ceausescu regime in Romania. Can you keep up? Let's move on to March of the year. You have the independence of Lithuania, and that's another step up, because until now it's been one Warsaw Pact country after another, i.e. allied regimes, but now it's a USSR state that's declaring its independence. So we're actually on USSR territory, although there isn't an actual invasion or presence of enemy troops. Let's consider it as a scenario that results in weakening. This supposition reflects the impact generated. Mongolia too turned the corner with its first free elections at the end of the year. After March of the year, we have October of the year with the independence of Lithuania. So yet another USSR state, another socialist republic that switches, and at the same time, I didn't note it on the vignette, but at the same time you have reunification. So with the German annexation of the Democratic Republic, so East Germany. So here too, progress is being made, and here it's NATO that's making headway, since this de facto part is integrated into NATO. So that's October of the year. Then you have December of the year with the appearance of free elections in Bulgaria. In fact, I've made Lithuania appear here because it was Geordie's, the bug from earlier. So wait, they were actually there. October of the year, right? Yes. Because there was a mix-up with the cards. Yes, I must have made a mistake. And in fact, if you want, afterwards, because the names I had on the files weren't at all what you had, I put the names of the places, in fact. Okay. So what was there after Lithuania's independence in the 90s? Then it was Thursday. We're on December 90s. Free elections in Bulgaria. Okay, so wait. Here we have free elections in Bulgaria. Then we come to 1991 with May 1991, Georgia's independence. Of Georgia, I had typed Lithuania, but I don't know if you corrected it. It was Georgia. So there it was again, a country that belonged to the USSR. And on the Caucasus side, then we have August 1991. So in August 1991, there was a lot of movement, because August 1991 was the time of Yevgeny Genayev's attempted coup, who was a reactionary communist coup d'etat, I'd like to say, who wanted to say no, but it's not possible with Gorbachev, we're going to fail. So we've got to replace him. So the idea was to replace Gorbachev with hardline communists. Not only did it go wrong, but it led Armenia, Moldova, and Russia to secede. Armenia, Moldavia, Ukraine, Belarus, the missing Estonia, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So there you have it. The progress of the Soviet defeat is still meteoric. In October 1991, you have the independence of Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, so further progress. And finally, we come to December 1991, which is where I didn't make a December 1941 card. No, but I didn't make a December 1921 card anyway, so let's leave it at that. Because in December 1941, what actually actually happens is that the USSR finishes breaking up. So it's all over in December 1941. First of all, on December 16th, Kazakhstan proclaims its independence. And then on December 26th, the USSR breaks up completely, meaning the end, the tipping point, the defeat. But as you can see, it didn't break out all of a sudden. It progressed gradually. So it advanced more and more from the margins towards the heart of the USSR. So to summarize what we've just shown you, you can see that morphologically, the end of the Cold War, and especially of this final phase of the Cold War, which corresponds to the First World War, which is basically the 1980s. I haven't even mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan in December 1949, at the same time as Czechoslovakia, etc. This shows that in reality, the movement of properly military reconquest and progression, which ultimately led to the end of the war in 1918, corresponds in the final months or years of the Cold War, one after the other. Countries that had long been influenced by Western propaganda began to fall into line, notably one of the references for opponents and dissidents in Eastern Europe, Radio Fruit Europe, which still exists, which was initially financed by the CIA and later by the US Congress. I think it was after the fall of the USSR that this funding was divided by 3. Maybe it's been increased a little since the start of the confrontation with Russia. But there you have it. There was a whole lot of work like that by the services, particularly the CIA, to get these countries to change. And so in the order of combat of the Cold War, where there was no military advance, no hot war, it's good. It fits in with this suggestion of war by the manner in which it maneuvers is reminiscent of an advancing military unit, yet it is driven by a significantly more extensive framework of conflict that encompasses ideology, individual perspectives, and the economy, and which also plays on the usual mechanisms, once again since somewhere, Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative and the economic warfare via Saudi Arabia. By draining Soviet resources while imposing new challenges, it weakens their economy and military strength, military capacity, in the same way that 1988 Germany was actually running dry from being under blockade. So morphologically, we can draw this parallel. And it's interesting because, in addition, it brings us back to the idea that the Cold War had begun in the same way. The Prague coup was already that, since it was the capture of a country, and that's what justified the creation of NATO in 49, because the communists were beginning to advance in Europe, but not with their tanks, but with communist coup de force. So this idea that that's what today's war of movement is all about is extremely interesting, and above all, I think it's worth demonstrating, because if we show that the war of movement phase at the end of the First World War corresponds to the collapse, one after the other, of the Warsaw Pact states and the independence of certain countries of the Soviet Union. I told you that I didn't understand the purpose of these relationship questions, but if we look at the war of movement in the First World War, Cold War conflict, it seems to suggest that the upcoming war will follow a similar pattern. So it's likely that the future will unfold in the same manner as well. War that is about to begin and has begun is to the Second World War what the First World War was to the Cold War. Then we have to expect that the war of movement phase will also involve countries like this, which in this case would be to Russia's advantage. And so this converges with what I told you about, and that I repeated last time. But now this is an opportunity to develop it, to try to forecast it, to try to see morphologically how it could happen. That Vladimir Putin's great strategic victory, which is within his grasp, I really think so. He'll lose eventually, but for now it's temporary, as I've already explained to you. But in the meantime, it will put us in a difficult situation. It would be the implosion of the European Union and the tipping of certain countries, if not into the Russian camp, since we've seen that in the end, the countries that broke away from the communist bloc didn't immediately go over to the West. That's not what happened. They partly went over to the West, since they adopted the free election system that was in the West. Agreed? So that's what you have to understand in the report. So conversely, moving over to the Russian camp would mean adopting populist but authoritarian governments in a number of countries, and this could happen in the context of a collapse of the European Union. So that's what I'd like to look at with you, to see what the morphology would be, because there's also the idea, and I've already mentioned it, that normally the war of movement, which allows the imperialist Rovacha to succeed, is that he makes a coup de force that nobody expects, and that's what allows him to achieve success in the war of movement. For instance, instead of becoming mired down, Napoleon swiftly defeated Prussia when he pushed into Germany. Germany. In a similar fashion, for the Germans, the Dunkirk fossil strike turned out to be notable. Well, from that point of view, it's not impossible that in itself the attack on the... I believe we briefly discussed this, and a few individuals mentioned it in their remarks, but now considering everything I just mentioned, it appears more logical to me. This text contains 207 characters. It strongly suggests that the European Union could collapse due to the current energy difficulties and tensions between France and Europe. The resulting implosion is a real possibility. The tensions between France and Germany I mentioned earlier and so on are precisely things that have been provoked by this crisis and by Russia's determination, in particular the mobilization in itself, a mobilization that the USSR didn't make. It's a signal that's being sent out. You see, these are the instruments of war that are important. And also the fact, for example, of hitting telecommunications infrastructures, which would be a continuation of the victory of these very technologies at the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, we'd be in this series, in the logical continuation of the way in which weapons play a role from one war to the next. So the morphology of regarding this conflict, that is, what could be the possibilities for the future? I'm going to leave aside the purely technical military aspects of what's happening in Ukraine, since we can see that in the final analysis, and particularly if we look at what happened at the end of the Cold War. And this is perhaps the most interesting thing about modern warfare. The military result itself counts for little, since victory doesn't depend on it, i.e. We've arrived somewhere at the ultimate stage of modern warfare. Modern warfare, that is, you know that the Second World War and the First World War are well known, and when you learn about them in high school, they explain them to you, were total wars, i.e. wars fought mainly between economic systems. In the end, the one who won was the one with the biggest GDP, who managed to mobilize his economy, who managed to maintain his production by having access to sources of raw materials and so on. That's what won the day in the end, not the skill of the generals. For those who were fighting, well, since the start of the Cold War, it's not possible that we're still in the upper echelons of this trend, i.e. that the army and its technical results no longer count for much. It has no effect. What really counts in life are the most fundamentally important things. Economy against economy, and psychology like psychology against psychology, and national, I'd like to say, it's not possible for it to be played out at that level. And so if we look at it that way, we may be making a mistake, thinking that at the end of the day, maybe it's not that important, that the Russian army is half in the stirrup in Ukraine, as long as Russia's resolve remains relatively intact, where they are still able to escalate on a number of axes, and where the economic consequences for Europe are significant, and above all relatively significant, i.e. we're in countries that are less able to withstand a certain number of shocks, notably because they're weakened for institutional reasons. And so in this case, putting aside the evolution of the conflict, at the very least, all that's enough for Russia is not to have had major successes in Ukraine, but at least to suggest that it hasn't lost yet. The conflict can last for a long time. That's the point. I said it could happen in Russia, within Russia's reach, because once again, North Korea is still there. So a North Korea of 140 million inhabitants with the raw material resources of Russia and a solid regime is an extremely powerful capacity for resistance. And so with mobilization, all you have to do is freeze and avoid losing Ukraine completely. And with general mobilization, you have enough to fuel the conflict for a long time. Alongside everything else that's important, i.e. maintaining strategic pressure, keeping tension on European logistical lines, etc., this allows the conflict to last. And that's what's most important. And that could end up bringing about the downfall of the EU. So we're seeing the beginnings of this with the difficulties surrounding the Franco-German relationship. We're also seeing it in a number of other countries. So morphology of the suite. I'm sorry, I feel like I've said this 3 times now, but I really wanted to make sure that everything was in place so that people could understand how I see the next step. I told you last time in the program we did on the general strike that probably the best model for a national revolution. A national revolution today, particularly on a European scale, is the German Revolution of Andreas XVI, precisely because countries that crumble when stressed, under pressure, while militarily it was still holding out, internally it was cracking, because people just can't take it anymore for a whole host of reasons. And yet, and this is important to emphasize, Germany of the First World War was still a federal state within which there were a whole host of states that had been unified only 50 years earlier, not even 50 years earlier, 8860 in pink, but they often retained a strong identity of their own. And how did the German Revolution really begin? That's when everything really started to fall apart because, as I said, we decided to give Parliament a bit more of a role, but things really broke down from November 7th of the Republic. See, that's when the Republic of Bavaria, which outside Prussia was the largest and most important state in the German Empire, Bavaria drove out its king and his entire dynasty. He simply fled and was proclaimed the Socialist Republic of Bavaria by the socialist Kurst Eisner on November 7 of the Republic. And that was the beginning, because after that, on the 9th of November, the uprising of SP Dresden and a host of other major cities. And so that's how it completely spread. And there was the uprising in Berlin too. So that's how it spread. So that's the model, as I said, that's the closest to what we can imagine back home. And it's very interesting because deep down, we're putting a lot of things back together tonight. I've been telling you for a long time that France is on the brink of revolution. And I think that France is the country in Europe that is, as I've already said, the weakest link in the European system, precisely because we're not a democracy like our neighbors. So we're the one whose regime is most vulnerable to violent collapse violently. In other words, things cannot be settled with the flexibility normally associated with parliamentary systems. In our case, we have a system that lacks flexibility, that is too rigid, and therefore may have given the impression of holding out longer. But when it blows completely. Well, and I told you this is what I thought would happen, probably even before next summer. It's my idea. I've already told you. I think Macron will leave before next summer. Deceived. But that's what I think. If he leaves next September, I hope people will say, someone will come up to me and say, you're wrong. In any case, within the margin of error, I think that's when he'll be leaving. France is the second largest state in Europe, following the Bavarian model of Germany, the largest state, behind Germany itself, which is a little like our Prussia on a European scale, i.e. the country which concentrates power and which, after its own reunification in the 1990s, became the dominant country in Europe. So if France were the first to let go, it would play the same role as Bavaria did on the 7th of November 1998. In other words, if Macron leaves Europe, it won't just have an effect on European countries. In the context of war, it won't just have the effect it would have if there wasn't a war. If there hadn't been a war, say if Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine right now today, and that therefore in the next 6 months Macron would fall. What would have happened would have been fairly calm in Europe. There might have been some unrest, but essentially the other countries would have joined forces to hope and try to achieve a fairly rapid resolution of the conflict and a return to order in France, probably with an orderly parliamentary transition. But in the current situation, with the tensions created by Putin's offensive, the economic difficulties and social unrest that are more or less latent in a whole host of European Union countries. If all hell breaks loose in France, there will be insecurity and contagion causing instability across Europe. The euro has already been in trouble for some time, and this could affect it even more, and that's likely to start the snowball rolling. So in particular, it could lead to a form of contamination in the European periphery. And let's not forget that the European Parliament itself is located on French soil in Strasbourg. So if the French regime were to fall, this would have major repercussions on a European scale, of course. In the context of a national revolution, loses basically the European Council on a European scale to the Parliament. So what this would mean is that the European Parliament would seek to take Europe's fate into its own hands, just as the Parliament, their hashtag, had done so from the end of the decade by trying to have a classic parliamentary government at the beginning of the Weimar Republic. So what would happen? The abdication of Wilhelm Tell would be matched by a genuine, a real seizure of power by the European Parliament. For example, it could table a motion of censure against the European Commission or decide to replace the European Commission itself with a kind of European government. That's the kind of reflex that would normally take place as part of a national revolution on a European scale, except that I've already told you that on a European scale, separatism has become marginal, even in countries such as, once again, Italy's Fratelli d'Italia, France's Rassemblement National, etc. Separatism has become marginal. Right-wing populist parties are no longer even anti-European. They're no longer in favor of leaving. Since the Brexit, things have calmed down a lot, except that it's in the current state of the European institutions. If, in the context of a collapse like that, a fall of France, of the French regime, and reversal, an attempt by centralization and the acquisition of greater power by the European Parliament. Well, we'd be in a system where all of a sudden this European Parliament would, it would be, if you like, a quantum leap in European integration. In other words, it would give even more power to the European Parliament and even less sovereignty to the states. And therefore, there would be a whole bunch of people like that who would eventually be left behind by the sudden advance of the EU. And there would probably be separatism re-emerging in reaction to that, quite simply. In other words, people who are not currently separatists under the current confederal system could be tempted to become so if all of a sudden the system becomes much more federal very quickly, which would be the case if the European Parliament became sovereign. At that point, separatism would be everywhere. And who stands to gain from stirring up separatism everywhere? Vladimir Putin, because that's already the case. Russia's propaganda is already targeting these audiences. It's going to have a bit of the same role as Radio Free Europe and so on. All these things at the end of the USSR's history. So separatism would emerge, supported by Moscow, with perhaps some attempts at a coup de force here or there. It's not impossible. You have to remember that the Gilets jaunes, there's a part of the French elites who got the impression that they were capable of going and taking over parliament, for example. So in a much more serious situation, and in other countries it can take place like that. And in that case, you'd have a number of countries at risk of plunging straight into civil war. Once again, let us discuss a war that involves the use of dynamic proxy tactics. What's interesting about the countries I mentioned earlier about the progressive collapse of the USSR is that for the most part it happened without bloodshed. There was a little bloodshed, especially in Romania, where Ceausescu was killed. But in the GDR, for example, Honecker opposed Gorbachev precisely for that reason. He wanted to maintain the traditional repressive system. And it was the German socialist who controlled East Germany who said to him, okay, you're out of here. It's not time for that anymore. But if Honecker had had the support of his inner circle, he might have tried to hold on to power. He would have ended up like Ceausescu, so there would have been scenes of civil war. We didn't have any in that system, not least because the transition was very much towards parliamentary regimes, I think. This would be a different matter. Since we'd be dealing with attempts to seize power in a slightly authoritarian, populist way, there would probably be scenes of civil war. So you could have several European countries that are exposed to scenes of civil war, or even European countries that are on the verge of total civil war, with Russia on one side trying to play its part, and NATO on the other, especially the United States, trying to regain control, and perhaps, as I've already mentioned, a third player such as Turkey, which will also try to push its pawns more or less to the right or left. And so, in all likelihood, this is what will happen. In other words, you'll have a sort of general chaos that could have Europe, or at least a good part of it, and then it could open up new avenues for action, for example, in countries. It's perhaps at that point, once that's happened, that Putin will decide to invade the Baltic states, for example, because that will become more possible, because NATO will be busy beforehand trying to take over the territory of the European Union. So on the margins, it will be possible to act like that. You'll have countries that are a little Eurosceptic, but at the same time benefit a lot from Europe, like Poland, but at the same time are very anti-Russian. I don't see them separatism within the framework I've just described, but they may be tempted to be both very pro-NATO and suddenly very anti-older people, and so turn against Germany. There could be any number of things. Just about anything is conceivable in the conflicts that could arise. What is certain is that on the whole it's going to correspond to this idea of dynamic proxy warfare. In other words, the movement ultimately would be about taking control, both temporary and perhaps only partial, but sufficient to be significant, as was the transformation once again of the Warsaw Pact regimes, which didn't become pro-NATO right away and didn't join NATO immediately, but which, if only ideologically, were closer to them. This represented a significant defeat for the USSR, and it would represent a significant defeat for NATO and the European Union if a number of Basque countries were to join NATO. Union if a certain number of countries went over the edge. In Hungary, Orban is known to be very friendly towards Russia, open to Russia, not least because he feels somewhat tied to its gas needs, etc. He could switch directly to the Russian side. This could lead to conflicts in the Balkans with a potential for intensified violence of conflicts in the Balkans, with a return of the desire to annex the Serbian Republic of Bosnia. We haven't heard much more from Milorad Dodik. Things aren't going too well, but he's frozen things in place, as I told you, while we wait to see how things play out in Ukraine. In the chaos of Europe, it's this kind of movement that would make progress. And so we'd really end up with a multitude of proxy wars on a European scale, corresponding corresponding to what would have been the advance of the German army in the USSR in France, but which would be an advance by proxy from Russia to all European countries, in the same way as, in a way, it represented an advance by proxy from the West, the fact that the countries of the Warsaw Pact fell one after the other, and that certain countries of the Soviet Union itself demanded independence in the late early 90s. So that's how I see the morphology of the current conflict in Europe. Of course, there's also the fact that in this case it would open up a space, as I said last time, a strategic space for China to act on the other side, for example. And we can't totally rule out the possibility that at the same time internal difficulties in America, which make the situation even more difficult, particularly in terms of America's ability to react to all this. I think it's still a little early for the American Civil War I'm talking about, which should lead to the authoritarian mutation. Maybe I was mistaken about the American regime. If my assumption was wrong, it will complicate the European Union situation during the Corsica War, benefiting Russia strategically. Russian strategy in the EU situation and the US's risk of civil war won't be discussed. The risk of civil war in the United States, maybe I'll do the next show on it, or at least one of the next shows, as I've already promised. But now that you've seen how it might tie in with what's happening in Europe, I think it's more important to do it now. Now, we've already done that. That's why I think this question can consider this question of the war of movement to be historionomically settled. I'm quoting him again because I really thank him. Thanks to Dennis's suggestion, who gave me a good boost. Sometimes it doesn't take much, even if in this case it was a substantial contribution because he came up with a concept. But it gave me a boost. It enabled me to see things differently. That's often the problem when you try to do morphological reasoning like that. Sometimes you don't look at things the right way. You simply have to take a step aside to see things differently. And that's what I did with the return of the war of movement at the end of the First World War and the gradual collapse of the USSR. I think it was convincing. You're going to, and you can tell me in the comments. However, that's the essence of it. It filled the crucial void to fully comprehend the morphology of the war. While traditionally wars unfolded through distinct military advancements as observed in Napoleon's reign and in Russia's history, that held true only in the backdrop of future conflicts. In terms of the conflict structure, I initially envisioned a progressive Russian military dominance involving frequent invasions upon Russia. That is, classic invasions under cover of nuclear weapons, which could still happen because if you have a country, for example, civil war with a pro-Russian party, the Russians can take advantage of this to intervene militarily and enter the territory. So maybe that will happen, but it's not an outright invasion. It's in this new context. Now, the movements I envisaged in the class of future wars, I think I can keep them simple. Rather than a pure and simple invasion, they would take the form of this, i.e. things by proxy effectively, and rather hybrids that work in this way. And conversely, the end of the war will probably take the same form, that as in the end, in the class of wars to come, I envisage that part of Russian territory, for example, will be invaded by Turkish forces in particular. That's what I saw coming. It's not impossible that this invasion will take the same form. In other words, there's already an article, I don't know if it's very reliable, that I've seen passed around, which would seem to indicate the desire of certain Turkish-speaking minorities in Russia to rebel against Putin's power because they don't want to go and be killed in Ukraine, and possibly by seeking Turkish support. It could be just the same sort of thing, i.e. Muslim or Turkish-speaking minorities on Russian territory who would enter into a rebellion against Russia and who would be subtly equipped and supported by Erdogan's Turkey, but without there being an invasion by the Turkish army, of course, on Russian territory. And at that point, you can't retaliate with nuclear weapons against an invasion that isn't an invasion if it's your own Muslim and Turkish-speaking populations that are rising up. But the fact remains, if there is this kind of invasion, and at the end of the conflict, the territory of the Russian Federation splits in two, with Turkish-speaking republics declaring independence, then naturally these republics will be in the hands of those who supported them before, i.e. Turkey. And so that's how this sort of confederation that I've called the Pan-Turkish Empire could come about in a second phase. So really this idea of seeing the conflict in this way is extremely interesting because the movements predicted and discussed in the Atlas of Future Wars are still valid, and they simply have to be seen in this light. So I think what I'm saying in the maps and what I'm saying about morphology and the time it would take is the same. It's just that rather than thinking in terms of direct invasions, we're going to be working more along these lines. This type of operation, I think that's the lesson we can learn from this. And that concludes my presentation. I told you it would be quite copious. I think I've spoken for more than twice as long as usual. I don't know if there are a lot of questions and if we're going to finish very late, but it seemed important in my vision of the conflict.